Welcome to week 5. We're zooming right along. I want to call your attention to readings and just do a little general check-in. So the current readings with Asante, and that's in the syllabus, beginning Kelly, kind of bring us into the Common Era, what we used to call back in the old days AD, in the year of our Lord, with the Gregorian calendar. But now we talk about before the Common Era and then after the Common Era, Common Error, Common Era. The reading, as I was skimming over yesterday, we were talking about some of the other kingdoms, African kingdoms like Kush and Axum and other, the word Ethiopian, for example, I'm reading from page 95 here. The word Ethiopian was applied by the Greeks to all people in Africa south of Egypt. Other Africans would have been called Libyans. Okay? So one of the conventions that I want to call our attention to is the idea that the so-called Middle East is a fictional invention of the British Empire, i.e. it's separate. So for example, when we talk about empires like Carthage, which gave rise to generals like Hannibal, Carthage is in what is now Tunisia, but also the Phoenicians also had made port in what is now Lebanon. So when we're talking about what's so-called Middle East, we're still talking about Africa in the ancient world as it was conceived of. So some of the readings that one part of the reason for giving you a little bit of picture before the African origins of Christianity, that's also part of the readings within Asante. He's talking about the idea of the Persian Christians, the Syrian Christians, the other folks who were basically creating the foundations, some of which we still see, but those roots have largely been obscured. So current readings with Kelly, when we visit other classical queen and kingdoms, Axum, Kush, and the like, we're also beginning to see briefly the effect of Christianity in its native habitat. And its native habitat is Africa, and we see different pieces of that. And so when we start looking at not only the fall of the Roman Empire, but the succeeding Dark Ages, and then the creation of a cultural glue fashioned out of the memes of Christianity. And if I haven't talked about memes yet, we'll probably do that later today. But begin to look at what Christianity looked like. Not that we just want to focus on that particular religion, but part of how it forms Western civilization and the world we have today begins to tie in. So I want to also bring your attention, if you want to increase your library, this book by Cheikh Anta Diop, Pre-Colonial Black Africa, distributed by Independent Publishers Group, Lawrence Hill Books, 1695, African World History, now available for English in the first time. It's been out actually been part of my library for a good decade or so, but it's still available. He talks about the political and social systems of Europe and Black Africa from antiquity to the formation of modern states. Now, part of what I like about Diop is, like Asante, goes into a lot of depth, maybe more depth than the casual reader might want to look at, but maybe you could expand your horizons as an example. So, I want to talk about two things within African culture: tradition and innovation. So African and African Americans' culture is based on unifying diversity, as we conceive of it here in the 21st century. Okay, so when you have 1,800 to 2,000 languages, at least 5 or more religions. So I'm not talking about the Abrahamic three in order of appearance, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So beyond the Abrahamic three, where you also might have, in addition to those Abrahamic three, some sort of tribal religion like Vodun, or an animist type of religion, basically where it's saying that the supreme being or supreme beings exist with us in the world, and natural features and rocks and things like that, and invisible spirits. So 5 or more religions that could go on in one single tribe or tribal group. 5 more religions are in spiritualities. 12 kinds of marriage, and when I'm talking about 12 kinds of marriage, I'm talking about 12 kinds of marriage among practice in what is modern day Benin in the 1970s, as basically tracked by a white anthropologist, and this is documented in Audre Lorde's book, Sister Outsider. So 12 kinds of marriage, integration of gender expression, multiple leadership styles, lifelong learning modes, lifelong learning modes and conflict resolution styles, and you have to utilize diversity, not simply quote unquote celebrate it or accept it. You actually have to find a use for it, an integral use for it, and that's what you build a society on. Yes?
So the idea of the religions, you mentioned that within one tribal group you could have multiplicity of religious expression?
You could have multiplicity of religious expression.
No conflicts amongst people. That was just
no, right. Because, consider that, as in Asante's the readings of Asante is basically talking about the influence of Christians from Persia, Syria, et cetera, and, they're influencing pre-Christian societies. And the model of Christianity they're using is not necessarily one based on conquest. It's just, okay, well, we believe this, and this guy, lived, et cetera, and these are some of the ideas, basically, because Yeshua didn't necessarily preach anything that was outside of Judaism. He basically created a synthesis of it, and his own original synthesis of it. So that's part of the whole tradition and innovation. He came out of a tradition even though he wasn't considered Jewish, right? The innovation was how he put it together. Basically, simply like my isms constructs. Like, to say that there's 6 kinds of isms is basically to take all the literature that's happening with black writers and say, okay, I need to simplify this down. Let's say that there's 6. And then, the original literature was racism, but then we can expand it to others. So
it's the same style of spirituality.
Yeah, right. So we've seen in the ancient African constitution, back to slide please, thank you. We've seen the ancient African constitution and the Bill of Rights in chiefless societies before Kemet. So African democracy utilized all adult voices in the community, 13 plus years old. It was reinforced by an extended family-based education and judicial system. So it was your family that judged you, and if the offense that you had committed was larger than the family could handle, then it went to the tribe. And this was an innovation in response to survival needs, that is, uniting different people, which became a tradition. How do you functionally unite and include different people, different beliefs, and different skill levels? So tradition and innovation inform each other. This comes out of Robert Farris Thompson's book Flash of the Spirit, where he basically says, these aren't necessarily art or artifacts, they're also indicators of a profound cultural wisdom. So, when that system was destroyed, that is the ancient Constitution and Bill of Rights and chiefless societies, it had to be recreated. So, for example, racism didn't exist then, but differences did. So those last 2 words on the slide, shibboleth. We would call that today dog whistle. That is a signal that only certain people hear. So a shibboleth literally comes from the Bible, even the King James Version of the Bible. When the nation of Israel was formed, and this is after the Exodus, so they were ruled by the judges, and they had female judges, right? So this is often one of the bases that I talk about, Barak's name is actually both not only Islamic, but it's also out of Judaism. So the judge, I believe her name was Deborah, only a female judge mentioned in the Bible, sent the good general Barak on a mission. And in the time of the judges, they were having a war between two different factions, and when the sentries were posted at night and people came upon those sentries, they asked them to pronounce a particular word that had to do with a torrent of water. So, if you see, go back to slide, if you see the spelling of that word, shibboleth, and the correct pronunciation might be shibboleth. Shibboleth, shibboleth, shibboleth. So 3 different pronunciations. So the correct one would be shibboleth. If you pronounce it shibboleth, you were obviously an enemy and they killed you. Okay? So this became the term that was used in an earlier book that this class was built on, Lerone Bennett's Before the Mayflower, basically to talk about, you can tell a person's cultural and political framework by the language they use. Like, is it the Civil War, the war of northern aggression, or the war between the states? Well, that will change depending on who you are, right? So obviously the war of northern aggression is the southern point of view, and also whether you believe that war is fought over slavery is also the southern or northern point of view. So you can also tell a person's political orientation, basically where it's red states, blue states, or the United States of America, by the use of language, and also the things that might set them off. We call them dog whistle politics. So for example, when you say crime, what does the criminal look like? Is it a person of color or a black person? When you say urban music, okay, is that black music? Rhythm and blues, the blues, rock and roll, when that was originally called race music, when Elvis Presley, basically copied what he saw in rural Mississippi of the black artists basically covering that music. And why is it called rock and roll? Well, it's part of an African tradition, basically uniting opposites, where it's the part of the male anatomy that becomes hard like a rock, and the female anatomy, the jelly roll. Rock and roll. Jelly roll, Morton, basically, it's sex, uniting, right? Opposites attracting. The tradition and innovation, coded language. So, in Western civilization, differences have been used to divide and conquer, that is, dominate. So Africans in America study how to unite people through the differences by studying the barriers to unity. So we train for the barriers, study the structures that support the barriers, until the barriers are stepping stones. Hence, the study, for example, of isms and crash. It's not that we're obsessed with race and racism, but it becomes one of the more obvious barriers that is often dismissed as being real. So paradoxically, the way to create unity is to dismantle the things that divide us, if only in our own minds and hearts. But you have to know how these things affect you to do that. And so you can't teach what you don't know. You can't lead where you don't go. In order to unify, you have to create the unity yourself, within yourself, in your own vision. So we haven't talked about memes this term yet, have we? Okay. So meme, the word M-E-M-E, meme is to gene. Basically, a gene is the smallest unit of replicating life. And this is coined by biologist Richard Dawkins, who's a noted atheist and science person. But his concept, where he wrote in a book called The Selfish Gene, basically talks about how much of our behavior is genetically determined. And he coined the term meme to basically say the smallest unit of replicating thought. This concept that Dawkins basically promoted in '85 is the source of our term something going viral. So a meme is basically like a virus of the mind. So as a gene is the smallest unit of replicating physical life, a meme is the smallest unit of replicating thought. So meme, like a virus of the mind. And like genes, memes combine to become viral ideas. And they're essentially transmitted through any mode of human communication. And then they mutate according to the minds that they infect or the minds that promote them. So I like to think of memes and also mimetic engineering. So if a meme is a virus of the mind which can infect an open mind and begin replicating in it, the smallest unit of replicating thought, it can have an influence beyond its small size. So memes transmitted through any form of human communication, language, images, art, technology, beliefs, spirituality, religion. Okay, so once you understand the concept, and it's a tricky one to get, because they're everywhere. You can basically detect memes in operation and cause a few of your own. So, for example, the concept of microaggressions is a meme. Basically used to describe certain behaviors that are probably more widespread than people using fighting words like the N-word. And they don't necessarily have to be on race, though that's where they were first detected. So, for example, this word tree basically is I started a brainstorm. So, Niger, Nigeria, Niger, Nigeria, Africa, basically from the Greek language. So I'm reading from the top. So these are place names. Niger, Nigeria, Africa. Place names. The second line, Negar, N-E-G-A-R. That's a person from a place. So from Africa. So a Negar, N-E-G-A-R, is a person from Africa. Once you make the translation from Greek into German, you get Negar, N-E-G-G-E-R. Still, a person from a place, a person from Africa. And the N-word, N-I-G-G-E-R, since English, a lot of English words come out of German, partially because of German conquest and also partially because the German educational system, the university system, became the English university system, which became the American and Canadian university system. So you can see a mimetic transfer, just from language, right? Yeah.
So you can be totally overwhelmed by a meme and not even know
Right.
that it's there.
Yes.
It's just so inherent in you because of...
You would think that it's normal. Basically, just like birds, air is to birds what water is to fish. So Negro in Spanish, which means black, Niger, Negar, Neger, Nigra, which is American English, trying to the combine of Negro and the N-word, or if we basically look at the African American reclaiming of that, Niggaz, never ignorant, gaining goals always, Tupac Shakur. So, swert, from the Latin, which means dark, swarthy, gives rise to the English word swarthy, which means dark complected or colored, or Schwarz, German for black, Schwarzkopf, black head, like Storm and Norman, the American general, German name. So this is literally a family name of black Germans, or Germans of African descent, if you will, Afro-Europeans. Same for Schwarzenegger, which literally means black and from Africa. Right? So as an example of memes, how they transmit, how they work. This is, why are you called what you're called? Your family name either came from someplace, or you did, like you were Cooper, you're a barrel maker, Parker, you took care of the king's land, Smith, you worked with metals, etc., etc. Abak, Abyssinian, so that's an Ethiopian person from Russia, in the Russian language. Abakidze, Arab, which is synonymous with Arab. Arapov, these are proper names in Russian. Aksakov, and there was a famous trader about 1000 AD, or 1000 in the Common Era, Shimon Afrikanovich. He made it all the way up to Russia and traded between Russia and Africa. Other words that are synonymous with black people: Moor, Turk, blackamoor in English, mulatto, which is a Portuguese slavery term, quadroon, octoroon in Jeffersonian racial language, and then high yellow, red bone. These are basically terms where you're high yellow means you're probably lighter skin mixed either with Caucasian. Red bone is basically acknowledging you're mixed with Native American. All right, so you can see that names basically are another mimetic expression, if you will. So when we talk about race and race mixing, it's almost archaic, but not quite, because there's still a factor where race still is a factor in terms of social justice, social power. There are constructs of race, and therefore ways of speaking, that is grammar, and acting, etiquette, around race. And like certain racial do's and don'ts. And race mixing is considered one of them in white supremacy. That is in the last 700 years. Because in the ancient world, people mix. It was understood that people are attracted to each other, and basically it's not so much about what you look like, i.e. skin color, but where you're from, who your people are. So the meme given to us by the 1970s Commission on Civil Rights, race plus ism equals racism. There are constructs or memes of race within the English language. So one of those memes is race is biological. That is, there's one race, the human race, Homo sapiens sapiens. Been around for 250,000 years. There is political constructs of race, in which politics is the science of the distribution of power. That is, who has power and who doesn't. So, for example, the indigenous meme, the indigenous meme of race, that's in operation in pre-colonial, pre-Columbian Turtle Island, is 4 races and 4 directions. So four directions, and also racial and also gender equity is part of that particular meme. Then coming out of Germany, three races construct: white male supremacy, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid, and then the federal five plus other, still white male supremacy light, where others can earn privileges of the, say, the GOB, the Good Old Boy Network. So prejudice plus power equals racism, 1970s Commission on Civil Rights. Politics, basically politics is the science of the distribution of power. So politics, then science can be influenced by politics, and religion can also be influenced by politics. We can give you the power to reinforce your prejudices as policy. And policy is simply a way of a written or unwritten agreement on how we're going to approach a particular problem. So in the indigenous meme, coming out of their spirituality, basically all people were equal. All humans were part of basically creation. So there's not the northern white folks are not superior to the southern black folks, and the eastern yellow folks are not superior to the western red folks. They're just all part of the human whole. In the three races meme, white male supremacy, that was basically God, i.e. a male God, creating humanity after the flood, and basically the superior first race is Caucasoid, because everybody else got destroyed. Then the Mongoloid devolved from them, and the Negroid race devolved from the Mongoloid within this particular framework. Notice that even though this framework is invented after the discovery of America, Native Americans are not in it at all as a polity. So in the Federal Five, basically, which came out of that German to England to American curriculum, it explains the world in a particular way, the Columbus discovered America narrative. We have the Federal Five, the box that you have to check or is voluntary for you to check: unemployment and getting loans and all those other kinds of things, where it's white, Caucasian, non-Hispanic, black, and with a separate denominator, Hispanic or not, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, and let's see who's left, and then let's see. White, black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, or Alaska Native, and then mixed, other. So those social constructs of race. So there, it begins with a creation narrative to explain where differentiation came from. So in biological constructs of race, so there's just one race, the human race. So in that construct, there's no superior race. So pre-Western race constructs, for example, like the medicine wheel, the sacred hoop, the crossroads, that are indigenous here. So those crossroads, and the crossroads is basically what I refer to as an African construct like a medicine wheel. So in the beginning, the story goes, Creator created four races, one for each of the four directions. Each was given a piece of the truth. So this particular crossroads, the Tsalagi, Tsalagi, are also known as Cherokee, and the Lakota people both have similar creation stories about that basically have a pre-Columbian, pre-contact, or at least from the point of view of Western civilization, pre-contact notion about where people came from. So in the beginning, Creator created four races, one for each of the four directions. Each was given a piece of the truth, which was their way of knowing the world and their own relationship with Creator and all that is, and that also translates into technologies for knowing the world, both spirituality and also things that you do with your technology for survival. before they scattered, they agreed to what would be called in English a covenant. Sometimes the Ark of the Covenant, or the legends of the Anunnaki, which is basically a extraterrestrial race of beings or whatever is associated with this. Not sure where that came from. I'm going to leave it alone for the moment. But it's basically a covenant. They scattered to the four directions, sometimes meeting and recognizing each other as kin, though they were different, and sometimes creating new peoples. So there came a time, after the people were sent away or went away, that they forgot that each one of them had a piece of the whole truth to be carried with them and shared, not the only truth to be imposed on others in conquest. So this has been forgotten, and three of the four races have tried to impose only one truth on themselves and each other over time. And if you think about, the history of humankind, even in the Western point of view, basically at one point, all three, other than Native Americans, have attempted world conquest at some point. So the whole truth cannot be known until the four races come together and share what they know, starting with what they know. And this is the 7-point empowerment is kind of like a movement taught among elders, used to be more or less internal to the culture and not really shared outside of it. So the 7-point empowerment is kind of like a movement meditation like Tai Chi, the 7 directions, the 4 directions, above, below, and within. So 4 directions, 4 races: east, yellow; south, black; west, red; and north, white. And part of the empowerment is basically each, you act as a conduit and doing the movement, sending prayers to the people of whichever direction you're facing and receiving blessing back, and then integrating the heaven and the earth energies within you. So each race was to remember the covenant in their own way, and the way that Tsalagi chose was to create this 7-point empowerment. That movement empowerment is about 1,000 years old, and native to Turtle Island. In it, each direction sends blessings and prayers to the others and receives blessings back. And I'm not going to demonstrate it here on camera, but it's very similar to Tai Chi. So the Lakota also knew of the 4 races and 4 directions, and sometimes they display it symbolically like this. One version of what is called the medicine wheel and sacred hoop, and other names. So 4 directions, 4 races. Turtle Island, North and South America. This is the West, the red race. Alkebulan, the South, land of the blacks, the black race. Europa, or Europe, the white race. And Asia and Pan-Asia, the yellow race. So Africans take that same idea and call the crossroads, and also the circle of life. The crossroads are the intersections of change, the meetings of heaven and earth, physical and spiritual. So in a midrash, so this African crossroads, which does resemble somewhat like a targeting system, but the inner circle where the crossroads meets is a person's inner reality. The line that's moving up and down is considered heaven to earth, and the line that's moving horizontally is the past, present, and the future. So the present, heaven and earth, intersect the present in the center, where the individual is, who is also moving to the future. So heaven above, earth below, past behind you, and the future before you. The crossroads can also symbolize the invisible world and the visible world. So the invisible world is the one that you experience internally that generates archetypes. The visible world is what other people see in your language and behavior and technology. And sometimes, in the words of some native elders, people MSU, they make stuff up about you based on what they think you're doing. So the crossroads, so not only indeed talks about heaven and earth, the past, present, and future, but also the visible world and the invisible world. Yes?
So the visible world is how an individual appears to other people?
Yes.
And how the others read that
Yes.
behavior?
Right. And they may or may not know the inner world, unless they basically have the same experiences or to the degree that language can explain that particular thing.
Know where you're coming from.
Know where you're coming from, right. So 4 races, 1 race. So each race has its own invisible world and visible world. And sometimes, you know, when we're talking about mixing the Jalagi and Lakota story, the whole truth can't be known until you know each race's visible world and invisible world. Because they may share some things in common. They may share the same ability to be human, but they've diverged quite a bit. So, using the crossroads as a empowerment or a model for empowerment or domination, if we define power as the capacity to become effective. So power in the dominant culture means the power to dominate, to rule through fear, or the threat of violence. It depends on ignorance or lack of self-knowledge or self-mastery. Now, last week and the week before, we were talking about the difference between a slave, self-mastery, and slavery. So a slave was a person in Africa who lacked self-mastery and displayed courage. So in warfare, if you didn't display courage, you were abandoned by your people and then taken up by the victors, and then you also had the right to basically the same human rights in terms of education to improve yourself, if need be. So, societies can structure ignorance. Now, Kemet did this. So, those of you who commented, oh, you're making Kemet sound like a utopia. Well, I don't believe that utopias have capital punishment, and Kemet did. So, yes, Kemet didn't have prison. That's because they could kill you. And if you were a thief, they'd cut your hand up. That's where part of where that practice came from, most notably in the Arab world. Also beheading. Lots of people kill people by beheading, but you know, that's part of where that society wasn't exactly a utopia, but there are some things that it had an advantage over this one. So self-knowledge or lack of self-knowledge or self-mastery. Empowerment means that you show others how to become effective in developing peace through knowledge. It depends on wisdom, which comes from self-knowledge and self-mastery. So power is also the ability to tell the difference between empowerment and domination. Know what the difference means and use the difference to build unity. So, oftentimes people control other people through fear, not knowledge. Fear and ignorance, not knowledge and wisdom. So, power environments are constructed. power is a construct. So, domination requires some have less of a particular type of power or particular types of power than others. So, domination requires somebody have more power and others have less power rather than the power be distributed equally, depending on what the construct is. So, who does the defining? And then what types of power? So if you remember my Wade Noble's quotes, is that power is the ability to define reality so that others respond to your definition as if it were their own. This can occur in both an empowering context and in a domination context. And that power environments can be constructed for either way. Yes?
So, I mean, they both would have to have some kind of a hierarchy,
Yes.
just in order to just function.
Yes.
It's a matter of the actual sort of spiritual motive behind it.
Right. Yes, they both have a hierarchy, something better, something worse. So,
And a functional thing.
and have to be functional. So the hierarchy could also easily be anyone can attain the hierarchy and we'll give you the skills necessary to do so, or we will constrain your ability to do so by defining and keeping the ability to become effective to ourselves. So that's why I was basically trying to make the distinction in terms of the power environments constructed both by African democracy and also indigenous democracy. Okay? The power, the ability to have a voice in the government is distributed equally. And you choose to have a voice or not. But you have the skill and the ability to do that, and the power structure is set up so that you can influence. Now, the Founding Fathers did not construct democracy in that way. They basically felt, the elite should rule the many. And this was the only power construct that they knew. It was basically like the feudal system. King, some nobles, everybody else is serfs. All right? So who does the defining and what types of power are we talking about? So we had already looked at the 6 isms, but basically that's one way of looking at how power can be distributed through one particular type of discriminator. So this is a story. It's adapted from a story in David Bradley's book, The Cheney'sville Incident, which is a kind of like a modern historical, it's fiction, but it's based on actual events, or an attempt to, basically what David Bradley did was write a story based on the finding of a particular set of graves in Pennsylvania, which seemed to be separate from the family's grave. And so he created a story, and a historian who's basically, researching why do these graves come to be, and this story comes near the end of the book. And it's kind of a retelling of a story that is told from the religious, spiritual religious point of view of Vodun. The great sky god, known as Olorun, once in the old days had looked down and saw that humans were not free, for they feared the stillness that comes to all. So Olorun called Papa Legba, the messenger, an interpreter for the great sky god and the other gods, and told them to take the message out to humans that the stillness that comes to all, that humans call death, was not an ending of things, but the passing on of spirit, a change of shape, and nothing more. So one of the things in terms of commenting on this, one of the things that power over domination causes is basically the fear of death, or the fear of violence, okay, in terms of having power over people. And so once you don't have a fear of death anymore, there is no power over you. whatever they do. When the stillness came upon those they loved, they should not fear or grieve, but rejoice, because the loved one had merely left the body that bound them to the ground, and they had become a spirit that could fly wherever they willed. Oleron had given that message to Legba to take to humans. So Legba is a shapeshifter. And so Legba basically can appear as an old man, can appear as a woman, in which case she's known as Elegua. But in this particular story, Legba is an old man. Oleron had given the message to Legba to take to humans, but Legba was an old man, then tired and feeble, and he walked with a cane. He was too fond of his pipe and chair to make the trip. So Legba called to Rabbit and told Rabbit to take the message. Now, Rabbit can also be a trickster, just like the Brer Rabbit stories, right? Told Rabbit to take the message. Rabbit was swift, but Rabbit was stupid. The first human that Rabbit found was a man with pale skin, straight hair, and eyes as gray as winter. Rabbit told him all of Sky God's message, and thinking he was done, went away. The man with pale skin was not stupid like Rabbit. He saw that if he lied to the other men, he could become the ruler of them. So he went to the other men and said that Sky God had sent a message only to him. Now, in this framework, right, the truth is available to everyone. And you notices that with politics, like a truthful politician, really? Well, politics is based, and our politics is based on not telling all the truth. Which is why in court they theoretically say, tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you, right? But you can basically hold power over by people by compartmentalizing the truth. So he went to the other men and said that Sky God sent a message only to him. The other men who would not listen, for they said, if Sky God sent a message, why would he not send it to all? Good question. Wait, what makes you so special? So the pale man went away and thought, and came back and told the other pale men the truth. Then they all went to the men with dark skins and told them that Sky God had sent a message to them. When the dark men asked, why would the Sky God send a message to some and not to all, they said that it was because their skin was light, and the Sky God said it was because they were better than other men, that they should interpret the meaning for other men. Then they told the other men that the Sky God had said, with the stillness that comes to all, they would cease to be, their bodies would turn to dust and ashes, and that their spirits would burn in a lake of fire forever unless they did exactly as the pale men said. The men with pale skin all spoke the same, and the dark men became so frightened of the lake of fire that they began to do what the pale men said. But some of the men with dark skins guessed the truth. Those men did not fear the lake of fire, for they believed when the stillness came upon them, they would simply go to a place where there were no men with pale skins who stole the spirit by telling lies. And so they did not do exactly as the pale men said. They learned to read and write in secret, even though the pale men beat or even killed them for seeking knowledge. They were beaten and chained and starved, but it did not matter, for they believed the truth. Now, in Bradley's book, when he talks about this, he basically surmises that on the Underground Railroad, a group of people were caught between two groups of people that were hunting them as slaves, and so rather than be captured, they killed themselves. And this was the story that they were told as they were being killed and then committed suicide, and that was the source of the 13 graves that were found on this farm. That apparently, I mean, it's as good as explanation as any for who has unmarked graves next to your family farm. Like, where did they come from if you didn't have slave quarters? So, the hero is the teller of the tale. That tale, this tale that I just told you, is told from the point of view of Ifa, the religion known in Haiti as Vodun or Voodoo. It describes in allegory, a series of real events. In particularly how you can steal someone's spirit by telling lies that make them afraid, instead of teaching them to be more deeply connected through their souls to all life. Many addictions, and I will say all addictions, are often based on a lie, and all recovery then is based on deeper and deeper levels of truth-telling and discovery. So that tale you can basically control or dominate people by telling them lies disguised as the truth, then making that truth, in quotes, their religion, or the religion, their government, or the government, the schools, the commerce system. Because, as Bradley noted elsewhere in that Cheneysville incident book, basically that the church decides what the truth is, the schools teach that truth, and at one point the schools and the church were aligned, and then the government reinforces that truth, and business further enforces that truth. So that it encompasses everything within your life, so that you're never even thinking to question the existence of what purports to be normal. It never occurs to you to do that. So, in terms of special education, soul special education, soul is that numinous, luminous, resonant vitality. So I'm basically using the Aramaic Christian point of view here, but it's not necessarily just Christianity. So numinous means it's conscious, luminous means it's shining. There's sound, resonant, and there's vitality, life, which connects you to all living things, and which also causes you to value living things as if they were part of yourself. This is coming from an empowerment place. The ability to realize this connection is the pearl of great price, that is the personal inherited wealth of every sentient being, and definitely every human being. And not every sentient being, of course, is human. The capacity of one's soul is unlimited, but it can be suppressed. Generally, for the purposes of, shall we say, mundane, square institutions, soul expression is suppressed. So, part of soul special education, and the reason I'm going in this particular bird walk, is to basically talk about soul-oriented times 5. Now, in psychology, Western psychology, where Western equals white, and white is a construct, Freud basically said you're oriented times 3. The idea being, 1, you know who you are, where you are, what time it is. Okay, so you have a head injury. The paramedics come upon you and they say, "What's your name?" And the next question they'll ask you is, "Do you know where you are? Do you know what happened?" And then, you know what time it is, like who's president, what year it is, what the date is, etc., etc. Oriented times 3. The basic check for sanity. Okay? In an accident or otherwise. Oriented times 3. We do it in counseling, we do it in medicine, we do it lots of places. So, it originally came out of Freud, if I recall correctly. So, this is kind of like the Freud's ego orientation. So, ego, id, and superego. The ego is, I'm Mark Harris, this body is 60 years old, born on date certain, will die at some point, etc., has a history. Id is basically my primal survival and other impulses, like I'm suppressing the desire for the chocolate cake that's on the podium, even though it's gluten-free, etc., I'm not going to eat it now before I have lunch, right? If there were, if I had to go to the bathroom, I'm not going to find a convenient tree. I'm going to hold it because of my superego programming. Superego is basically the social programming. And in Freud's framework, basically the source of neurosis, that is forms of mental illness, are basically the conflict between your ego, your superego, and your id warring within your personality, meaning you're uptight or etc. You're neurotic, you have neuroses. Now, notice in this oriented times 3, whether it's superego, ego, or id, because basically it fits into the construct of knowing who you are, where you are, what time it is. It's all focused on the body and the personality and the person. And that's basically all Western society essentially cares about in terms of who you are and where you are. Who are your people? Where are you? Where do you fit in the social construct? But in soul special education, go to a slide, please. Thank you. Basically, this comes from a poem where I was, in teaching this material, in order to ground it, I had to actually write it and figure it out for myself. Your soul, in African American culture, is not a religious term, it is a technical term. It's part of your invisible essence, the real person. So, in order to be soul-oriented times 5, there are 5 questions that have to be considered. Who were you before you were born? Who were you before you woke up? And not just physically woke up. Who are you in your deepest dreams? Who will you be in your life? Who will you be after you die? So, who were you before you were born? Who were you before you woke up? Who are you in your deepest dreams? Who will you be in your life? And who will you be after you die? Yes?
And you can ponder all these on so many different levels.
Yes. All right, and so part of this is actually traditional. It's when I talk, the innovation is that I put it in a poem. And you don't actually work out the solutions in order unless you actually have. So again, so you could start with number 3. And who are you in your deepest dreams? Like, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? And then, who will you be in your life at any part? So part of the answers to those could be, if you become conscious in the state that's we call the dream state, you could answer possibly number 2. Who were you before you woke up? And that would put you in a place where you could answer the first question, who were you before you were born? And then answer, who will you be after you die? Because all those questions presuppose that you're conscious outside of the body, and that your consciousness will exist after your body is not there. Yes?
And that your life is transient.
Yes. Your life in the physical body is transient in terms of it happens in a time, space, place that you are not essentially limited to.
But the soul is not.
The real you. Yeah. The soul, your invisible essence, is the real you. So this is also part of not only many African-based religions, but other indigenous forms that also believe the same thing. Yes?
Well, I mean, in the West, those 5 points we looked upon as nonsense.
Yes, they are. That's why
Tragic.
the reason I talk about soul special education is the special education is that we're living in Western civilization from the point of view of indigenous or African or traditional people who are following a tradition that's older than Western civilization. They're basically saying you've been living in a civilization that suppresses the soul. It could be even soulless, right? So if maybe it isn't your soul that's stunted, maybe it's your awareness or your ego that's stunted. So we have to put you on a spiritual short bus if you those of you who go to school, who are bused to school as I was, right? So soul special education. So if you or your culture can't answer those questions and think that they're nonsense, then you can be controlled. Okay, because part of where fear or power with power using domination comes from is the fear of death. If you don't fear the death of the body, then you can't be controlled. You're essentially free. Doesn't mean that you're suicidal. Just means that, well, all you're going to do is put me in a place where I don't have to deal with you. But if you or your culture can't answer those basic questions, who are you in your deepest dreams? Who will you be in your life? Who are you before you woke up? Who were you before you were born? And then who will you be after you die? So, to the degree that you can culturally self-define those answers, to that degree you can be autonomous. That is, in psychology, even Western psychology, an internal locus of control in your soul. There's a Yoruba proverb which says, "May my outer head not spoil my inner head." And the inner head is the one that's connected to your soul. The outer head is the one that's connected to the world, the ego, the world of phenomena. This comes from Naim Akbar, who is an African psychologist, basically theorizes that the African self, unlike Freud, basically starts in the soul, the spiritual, that is the energetic connection and felt connection to the rest of the universe, and that the soul animates or inhabits the body, kind of wears the body like clothes. The mind, basically in this construct, the mind is also your emotions. In Western psychology, we separate those out. Mind thinks thoughts, emotions are feelings. Feelings are also felt in the body. So the mind, emotions, feelings are all kind of lumped into one in this particular construct. So the soul is the spiritual part of you, the body is the physical part of you, the mind is the bridge between the two. Then you also have a social relational self, and then you have a tribal ancestral self. And all these are the African self. And the African self is rooted in the soul, and each level is an individual connection to a greater whole. All of them, they interrelate to each one. So, know yourself, not only your ego, the depths of your soul, the health of your body, the clarity of your mind, and be aware of all those who face the same struggle you do are with you as the ancestors. And as allies, those you know now, your social and relational, basically those who can help you, no matter what they look like or who they are. Because sometimes even your adversary can help you. And then ancestors, those who have gone before, are still with you. So part of talking about this in terms of how self-empowerment begins to arise, and when we started talking about, those ancient kingdoms, this is part of the knowledge that was sort of handed down and then had to be recreated in the latter part of the 20th century. So the ancestors, those who've gone before, show us what's possible, and our allies help us make what is possible happen, even if it's never been done before. So part of any freedom or liberation struggle, when you're doing something that may or may not have been done before, where do you draw inspiration to basically accomplish the same goal? Is there a tradition that you can draw on? If not, then you'd have to create one, and that's innovation. An innovation that works becomes a tradition. But sometimes the traditions can't get you out of the situation that you're in. So you have to create a new innovation. And if that continues to work, then that becomes tradition. But you have to have both.
So it's like a constant, ongoing dialectic.
Right. An ongoing, shall we say, dialectic or dialogue. Tradition and innovation. And so one way of grounding that, so the reason that in ethnic studies or in this particular class we look at history, is you can basically say, look, this stuff happened before. Much of our world was influenced by that, not necessarily by, Western civilization, even though we're forced to speak this language that comes out of Western civilization. It itself also has roots that are older. And so this is basically the construction of a spiritually based reality rather than an ego-based reality in which you're only limited to, what is in your body and your immediate family of origin, if that, not necessarily to a people. So Naeem is basically saying what a healthy African American or African self, and basically also extending this to humanity, is you need to understand who your people are, and that could be all people. So anybody can have the inheritance of the African kingdoms, as even if they don't appear to be black people. This I got from a Maroon website in Suriname. I don't know that it exists. I've tried to find it again at the same place and got that 404 message, so I'm glad I got it when I did. But it basically, the Njuka Maroon life cycle. So The Njuka Maroons were in Suriname, South America. Maroons, basically taking that word from the Taino language, were first generation African native hybrids. Also, Maroon societies tended to be people who escaped slavery, but not simply escaped slavery, but created free societies outside of slavery that were not based on the Western forms, but also remembering traditional African forms and adapting them to the New World by making alliances with Native people, and then also intermarrying with Native people, so that, okay, we're creating a new free society here in this place. So we're basically using African traditions that we remember, and also native traditions that we are learning, and then creating a new blend. Yeah?
And were there towns like that in Florida, especially, where there was interaction with Seminoles?
Yes.
Specific old...
Yeah, the word Seminole basically is equivalent to Maroon. So I'll break this down. So, according to Njuka and Aluku Maroons, human beings have an Aka, that is an unchanging essential spirit, a soul, and a body. A person is born from the invisible world of the ancestors. They grow from childhood into adulthood in the visible world of the living. They grow old, they die, and return to the status of ancestor in the invisible world. When a person has lived a good life, his or her soul returns to the visible world after death as a newborn. This process is known as Ninseki reincarnation. So, as an African religion, Christianity actually did believe in this worldview. The Maroons, basically in Suriname, are reflecting an African worldview which is contemporary with the roots of Christianity and beyond, and also contemporary with Kemet. So at 3 o'clock, where it says death, or actually birth, that's birth, 3 o'clock to 1 o'clock, basically you have childhood, then maturity, adulthood, then at 9 o'clock, old age, and then physical death at 9 o'clock, and then from 9 to 3, you have ancestorhood. So at the center is your soul. And basically there's a cycle of reincarnation within the soul. Okay, so the center green is basically where your soul lives, your Aka. And it basically it reincarnates in the world. So both ancestors and unborn children exist in the same world, in the same worldview, in the same place. In fact, there's a movie, I think you can get it on Netflix, and it's also available on Amazon, Daughters of the Dust, in which the entire movie is narrated by an unborn child who is not born during the period of the movie. And so one of the trippy things about the timeline of the narrative within the film is basically this child is called into being by her biological grandmother, who basically is sensing all the tensions between this takes place in the Sea Islands. And in the Sea Islands, you had Africans being brought into America illegally, well into the Civil War and past the Civil War. Even though it was illegal to import slaves after 1808, the slave trade still continued in the Sea Islands of Georgia and Carolinas, right? And the Gullah people, or also the Geechee people, are descendants like of those folks. And some of them basically maintain an authentic African culture, and that's where this film is basically based in 1900s, where you have the matriarch of the family still practicing the old religion still, visiting her husband's grave and talking to him every day as if he's there, and noticing the tension between her children, who are basically fully feeling the pull of going to the mainland and becoming Christian, which is basically essentially a fundamentalist Christian, in which her ideas are basically part of the devil and Satan, right? And so what she's saying, and what the unborn child is saying, who's narrating the film, is that these ideas and Mama Bazan's beliefs are real, because not only is she narrating it, but she's coming into the world. She's basically in her mother's womb, but not necessarily locked in her mother's womb. She's wandering around among that village, making commentary and teaching us in different ways. So back to slide, thank you. So the Njuka lifestyle basically says reincarnation exists, that your soul essentially exists as an individual piece of something greater, and that you incarnate at childhood, die at old age, and then you become an ancestor, part of the invisible world around your folks. So within that cosmology. So the chart shows each of the 3 levels of existence in concentric circle: the inner circle, Aka, your essential spirit; the middle circle, Nenseki, which is the ancestral soul and process of reincarnation. The outer circle is the person in the life cycle that's visible. So the inner circle and the middle circle are basically the invisible world, and the outer circle is the visible world. The upper half of the circle represents the visible world into which people are born and out of which they die. And the lower half of the circle represents the invisible world inhabited by ancestors and spirits. And the 2 worlds coexist, but only ritual specialists, also known the English word mediums, usually see and interact with the invisible world. So in Western framework, these people would be considered crazy, because you're seeing things that don't exist. How can you see I see dead people everywhere. No, they're not dead, boo. They're just at a different phase of life in the maroon cosmology. So, black gnosis. Black gnosis is how we take this is from Kemet Amenta, which is our inner storehouse of universal knowledge, the one that's basically soul knowledge, if you will, the knowledge of what was and what can be, and set about making what was and what can be what is. So from there, go to here, see if we come up with the right place. Yes, we do. So just to backtrack a little, and to put it in context. So Asante is basically focusing mostly on Africa in the Common Era, and I want to basically talk about where the shift happened in African-based Christianity to Western-based Christianity. At the Council of Nicaea, the African and Asian branches of Christianity gathered what was considered Christendom. Now, notice that phraseology. Christendom is being considered as a European-based form of Christianity. The Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. And, well, Rome still falls, but converted to Christianity and convened all of the branches of the church. So you can understand from your readings in Asante that there is an African-based part of the church that is not getting up into Europe till way later in terms of establishing itself. There was, in fact, no united Europe in that time and in the Romans' time. So in order to unite Europe, you needed a unifying creed because you didn't have one, right? The Romans considered the Germans to be pagans. barbarian. In fact, our word barbarian comes from them, strangers. What barbarian means strange or foreign. All right, so the Emperor Constantine, in order to run an empire, you can't have all these various forms of Christianity in existence. You can't run an empire like that. You need a consistent message. So they set about creating one. A Christian doctrine. So part of the decision was to, one, call him Jesus, not his mama's name, right? And that he's going to be the only begotten Son of God. That is, God came down and got Mary pregnant, which is not what Mary said, or Mary's people said, either. And they'll make Jesus the only begotten Son of God, and kings, Christ's earthly representative. So those kings would be Caesar, also in German, Kaiser, which is the same idea as Caesar, and the Tsar. So notice just like I was talking about memes earlier with Niger, Negro, Negra, Caesar, Kaiser, Tsar. Same idea. Divine right of kings. They chased their authority to Jesus by accepting Christianity. The African and Asian versions of the church were not down with this decision, saying that Yeshua was a man and others could be like him, like he taught. So that was the idea of royalty, your service to others, your spiritual development. You don't need power over others. You need to master yourself. Naturally, this is not going to go down with the Roman ethic. Right? So, coming from that worldview. So liberation theology rests in the reality of African Yeshua, who spoke in a context which would not really be recognized as the same Christian context. So when the Aramaic Yeshua was converted to the Greco-Aryan Jesus, more happened than just simply a language translation or an edit job. A white Jesus is necessary to enable the doctrines of white European supremacy, and then domination of Africa, Asia, and the New World, the Americas. Yes?
So it was sort of a power grab to consolidate their power.
Right. To create a united Europe,
Right.
and then basically take that to the world.
That was the false premise on which it was all based.
That was the idea, right? Because reality, to build an empire, you need a single message, and conquest obviously wasn't going to do it, because what the Romans originally did, the imperial ideal, is basically, we conquer you militarily, but you get to practice your own language, your own religion, or you can adopt ours, but if you do adopt ours, then you also have to speak our language, and you also have to trade in gold, too, with us, right? But that wasn't going to work. That's why the first Roman Empire fell, essentially, because of rebellion, etc. So now they're trying the experiment over using a particular form of Christianity as the glue. So liberation theology. The doctrines supporting ethnic cleansing of the Spanish Inquisition, which we haven't gotten to in the time framework, the papal bulls establishing the doctrine of Christian nationalism, leading to the doctrines of manifest destiny, social Darwinism, the white man's burden, and eventually the policies called apartheid and Jim Crow. Basically are based on this particular form of Christianity. So the African version of Christianity never really got into the world conquering business. Not interested. Self-mastery. So the original teachings of Yeshua, where racism did not exist because it didn't exist in his time, were replaced by translations of the Bible which then justified slavery based on race alone, with a justification that slaves were being civilized from their savage condition. Right? So now we're seeing also a historical erasure. So black liberation theology positions itself in a context of social justice struggle. So that image, the image of Yeshua becomes a critical issue. So in a world without racism as we know it, the image is depicted without prejudice in Ethiopia, which as a country has practiced Christianity the longest in the world, and their image is of Christ as a brown-skinned, curly-headed man. So until the creation of a united Europe, this was the historically held image. Not until the Renaissance and Michelangelo's uncle, because that essentially was the model for the Sistine Chapel depiction of Christ, did the image change, and then only in Europe until colonization began. So for example, 18th century, which means 1700s, this is Christ raising Lazarus from the dead. So the hero is the teller of the tale. So history is the story that is told to explain the present and the future. So beginning with Scripture, Scripture is used to cosmologically explain the present. So in Christian mythology, for example, the creation story is based on a number of stories, some of which are hidden within Hebrew and Jewish mystery lore. Christians who believe that the King James Version of the Bible is the literal truth are mistaken, because as our language studies showed in the last 2 weeks with Aramaic and Amharic and Hebrew and Arabic being multi-level languages, the original languages are themselves multi-level, and so literal was only a surface reading of them. So the language of the Bible is based on were multi-level, not simply literal. So when you see these icons, for example, the Black Madonna, another icon. This is from Spain. And another vasis, another icon. Whatsoever you do to the least of these, you've done to me. So to explain what I showed you the other day, Miriam of Magdala. Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Miriam of Magdala. Adultery is improperly mixing with the world, not having sex out of marriage. Sin is following the desires of the material world rather than nurturing your spiritual self. Adultery is illegitimately mixing your true spiritual nature with passions of the material body. Sin is turning away from God towards concerns of the material world and the body. For you love, why do you suffer? You suffer because you love what deceives you. Acquire my peace within yourselves, for the child of true humanity exists within you. Follow it. Those who seek for it will find it. So note that the Gospel of Mary, that is Mary Magdalene, is not contained within King James Version of the Bible. This is considered one of the Gnostic Gospels, which, are not considered authoritative by some. And there's only fragments of this particular gospel, which comes to us from Coptic, which Coptic is essentially Greek. So according to the ancient tradition of the East, Mary Magdalene was a wealthy woman from whom Christ expelled 7 demons, not a prostitute. During the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, she helped support him and his other disciples with her money. When almost everyone else fled, she stayed with him at the cross. On Easter morning, she was the first to bear witness to his resurrection. She is called equal to the apostles. She is also referred to as the beloved disciple and Some also refer to her as his wife. And there's actually a sect, a Christian sect, that believes that they had kids. The Eastern tradition tells us that after the Ascension, she journeyed to Rome when she was admitted to the court of Tiberius Caesar because of her high social standing. After describe how poorly Pilate had administered justice at Jesus' trial, she told Caesar that Jesus had risen from the dead. To help explain his resurrection, she picked up an egg from the dinner table. Caesar responded that a human being could no more rise from the dead than the egg in her hand turned red. The egg turned red immediately, which is why red eggs have been exchanged at Easter for centuries in the Byzantine East. Mary traveled the Mediterranean preaching the resurrection. Like Peter and Paul, she died a martyr. Well, that's one story. Some say she died of old age in France, but she bears witness to the important role women once held in the church. Yes?
Which would have had African roots.
Yes.
I mean, that possibility.
Right. Right. Yes. The role of the sacred feminine is a hallmark of African religions in particular. So this icon was commissioned by Grace Cathedral in San Francisco to commemorate the election of Barbara Harris, the first woman bishop in the Anglican Communion. The inscription at the bottom of the icon reads, Saint Mary Magdalene. Its title is written in Syriac, the language, a dialect of the language spoke. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. The language spoken by Jesus. The gospel comes to us most directly, not from Rome or Greece, but from the deserts of the Middle East, so-called Middle East. We owe our faith to Semitic Christians such as Mary Magdalene.
Excuse me. Excuse me.
Oh, we're on camera. It's been
Sorry.
recorded. Yeah.
I just wanted to see what time it was.
All interesting. So, I had a conversation with a Tea Partier. And why are they called the Tea Party? And what was the Boston Tea Party? So this person was from Boston. And he said, oh, taxation without representation. And I said, well, what was that? And he said, I don't know. Well, a dispute between two groups of white people, one of whom did not have the heart to protest in their own appearance, but dressed up as Indians. Native government had universal representation and universal represented government and no taxes. So he said there was no government or civilization among the natives, which of course is fighting words to me. So I went off of him, brought tears to his eyes, but not that I beat him up, but he realized, what did he not know and how come he didn't know it? And he's from Boston, calling himself a Tea Partier, but not knowing what the Tea Party was about or where it came from. So how had his beliefs been shaped and on what narratives? So part of the foundation of modern isms, it could be argued, just like we had discovered that possibly the beginning of science starts with pregnancy. It could be argued that sexism is the first ism, as the roots of patriarchy precede the roots of racism. After the subordination of gender and gender expression and gender diversity begins, after the subordination of all those things begins, then divisions based on class, social stratification then can begin too. Because then who controls the division of labor and who are consigned to particular labor roles. So you can begin slavery, servitude, wealth, power. Okay? Race can be added to the equation, building upon what is beginning to be nationalism. Because basically, as Asante talked about within, the readings that you have, there are tribal states and tribal nations built up within nation states. And so, for example, the so-called Middle East, because Europeans were so enamored of straight lines, they create states in which rival tribes are contained within each other and don't have room to move across borders, therefore basically creating division, when people used to just keep to themselves. So people were discriminated upon based on national or geographic identity before they were discriminated against by race, because you could have multiple races within a particular nation state. Kemet itself had basically multiple, what we would call races today, but they were not necessarily divided up by skin color then, but they did note that there was differences. Yeah,
Kemet was huge,
it was huge.
but there were no lines and boundaries. It was all just landmass.
The lines and boundaries were basically along the lines of geographical features.
Rivers,
Mountains, deserts.
coastlines.
Yeah. So some of the foundations of the traditional canon. The traditional canon rests its foundations on a storyline using the Latin alphabet and using numbers and calculations from Arabia and Africa. This suggests multicultural origins, except that the non-white racial origins of the technology have been obscured. Because, when I tell people to identify the difference between, Roman numerals and then regular numbers, how are they regular numbers? Where they come from? And then somebody will inevitably say, Arabic? Right. So how did we start using Arabic numbers in English? So following the storyline, females, for example, made no contributions to building the culture other than being an integral part of procreation. Okay, exceptions occur, for example, Hypatia of Alexandria, a mathematician, philosopher, astronomer of the Neoplatonic school, that is 370 to 415. So between Hypatia and Madame Curie, no woman scientists exist in the traditional canon. Now, how is that possible? From BC to the 1800s, no women scientists. Is that even possible? How is that rationally possible? So you can see the traditional canon is kind of based on a massive edit job. So here's Hypatia of Alexandria, and then that's Marie Curie, a Polish-born French physicist and chemist, famous for her works on radioactivity. So no women scientists between Hypatia and Madame Curie. There's a little historical scientific gap there. So, historical erasure. Quote unquote, civilization, democracy, government. Who has it? Who made it? And who can make it? Who can participate in it? And whose participation is crucial. So, we have been doing some jumps. So I'm going to jump from this to start with some historical erasure that essentially then forms some of the policy on the foundations of whiteness, and also talk about the white roots of peace, but that won't come till a little later. So then we'll start where Kelly starts in about a week, but probably later this week, because you're starting to read Kelly, theoretically. So, what else is hidden? So, for example, in the King James Version of the Bible, you'll find a physical description of Yeshua in only 2 places in the New Testament. Daniel, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. Okay, so wool is got texture, and texture, because not all wool is white. The hair of his head like the pure wool. And his arms and his feet in color to polished brass, which is more likely bronze, but polished brass is definitely darker than Caucasian. And in Revelations, his head and his hair were white like wool, and white like snow, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in the furnace. So, two descriptions. So both contradict the Michelangelo depiction in the Sistine Chapel, but do kind of dovetail with the Ethiopian picture that I showed you. So you'll find the church describes Mary Magdalene as a prostitute, though the Bible never refers to her in this fashion. So, finding that curious, in an effort to explain inconsistencies in the Old Testament, there developed in Jewish literature a complex interpretive system called the Midrash, in which attempts to reconcile the biblical contradictions and bring new meanings to the scriptural text. So understand, writing something down not only freezes the story, but it's limited to those who will write. So scriptures came from oral traditions, and just like the hero is the teller of the tale varies the story. So who decides how many contradictions, how many conflicting stories get written down? And is only the written down ones the real ones, or what? Who's doing the writing? So Midrash. So Midrash in Hebrew, like its counterpart in Arabic Jidrash, refers to the ability to personally interpret scripture according to the inherent variability possible in the sister Semitic languages, Aramaic, Arabic, Amharic, and Hebrew. So a single word can have multiple meanings. Thus, any given scriptural passage derived from those languages can have multiple literal, relational, and metaphoric meanings, designed to be interpreted in the mind of the listener or reader. So like in Yeshua's time, not everybody was literate, like he wasn't. So employing a philological method and often ingenious imagination, Midrashic writings reached their height in the 2nd century in the Common Era and influenced later Christian interpretations of the Bible. Inconsistencies in the story of Genesis, particularly the two separate accounts of creation, received particular attention. Later, in the beginning of the 13th century, 1200s, such questions were also taken up in Jewish mystical literature known as the Kabbalah. So, essentially, the reason the title of the slide is Eve and Lilith is Adam had 2 wives, and Lilith was his first wife. So, Midrashic literature. Adam's first wife was not Eve, but a woman named Lilith, who was created in the first Genesis account. Only when Lilith rebelled and abandoned Adam did God create Eve in the second account as a replacement. So, Lilith and Adam were created together out of clay. Eve was formed out of Adam's rib. So, in an important 13th century Kabbalic text, the Sefer HaZohar, written by the Spanish Moses de Leon, it was explained that the same time Jehovah created Adam, he created a woman, Lilith, who, like Adam, was taken from the earth. She was given to Adam as his wife. But there was a dispute between them about a matter when it came before the judges. Wait, who are the judges? Are the judges human or are the judges non-human? But okay. 2 people and came before the judges, whoever they are, had to be discussed behind closed doors. Okay. She spoke the unspeakable name of Jehovah and vanished. Now, I'm not from that culture, so you're not supposed to either speak or even write the complete name in Jewish culture at all, nor pronounce the name. But Lilith did and disappeared. So, Judges, what Judges? So, in the Alpha Beta of Ben Sirah, an anonymous collection of Midrashic proverbs, come probably in the 11th century, is explained more explicit that the conflict arose because Adam, as a way of asserting his authority over Lilith, insisted that she lie beneath him during sexual intercourse. In other words, the so-called missionary position. And she didn't want to. She wanted to be on top sometimes. And she left Adam, disappeared. And then Adam was bummed out, and that's where Eve came in. And we'll continue the story Wednesday. So you're about to roll music? Yeah.